All right. Ready, rock? Cool. Okay. So we left off with the age of Andrew Jackson. Remember, John Quincy Adams was a one-term president, and he had defeated Andrew Jackson in the election of 1824. But remember, Jackson had won more of the popular vote and more of the Electoral College. No one had gotten over that 50% mark. Congress were the ones that decided it. So when Jackson runs for president in 1828, he runs on this campaign promise of he's the president of the common man. The Democratic Party drops Republican off the back of it. It's just the Democrats now. And Jackson is going to defeat John Quincy Adams coming into office as our seventh president. Little backstory on Andrew Jackson. He's very different than the first six presidents. He's born into poverty on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina out toward the west. As a kid, he was a spy during the Revolution for the Patriots. He was once beaten by a British officer. He, as a young man, makes his way to Tennessee. He teaches himself law. He gets involved in politics. He marries a pretty wealthy woman by the name of Rachel Donaldson, and became a war hero during the War of 1812. Had a pretty rough and tumble type of youth and early adulthood. Was involved in quite a few duels. Was actually wounded in one duel where the bullet was lodged in his chest. He's also got a number of different nicknames. They called him Old Hickory because he was tough. Native Americans called him Longblade because he was brutal. His opponents called him King Mob because he had a pretty rowdy inauguration party. People were having a pretty good time, and they decided to head on into the executive mansion and pretty much destroy it. So kind of a wild time. Jackson is going to be, compared to the first six, a bit of what we would consider like a nonconformist, right? He's of the common men, even though he's not technically a common man. He's pretty wealthy at this period of time. His war effort against natives and also in the Battle of New Orleans had catapulted his celebrity. So, pretty interesting character. His 2 terms in office is known as the Jacksonian era. The one thing that he really does in his 2 terms, he strengthens the power of the executive branch. So if you were to look at a $20 bill, he's on the front. If you turn it over, what building's on the back? Very good. The White House. Okay? Which at that time we called the executive mansion. We'll talk about when we start calling it the White House later. As soon as he comes into office, he is going to institute the spoils system. He puts a lot of friends and supporters into office. A lot of them don't really work out that well. He goes through a ton of different cabinet secretaries. Like, for example, he goes through 4 secretaries of Treasury in his 2 terms. Some of his appointees get involved in scandals. There's a pretty big embezzlement scandal that happens related to one of his appointees. He is wholeheartedly supportive of the common manhood suffrage. No longer do you have to own land to vote if you're a white male. That still is not a perfect scenario. But this is going to elevate him to victory in both 1828 and 1832. Without a doubt, the most controversial event surrounding Jackson is the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This was a little ironic because he had a pretty decent relationship with the Cherokee. In fact, in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend against the Lower Creek, there had been Cherokee who had actually fought alongside him as an ally. He actually ended up adopting a Cherokee child, but he was in the mindset that like if the natives weren't utilizing the land to their best benefit, then they needed to get off the land. And there are a couple of reasons why they want Native Americans out of the Southeast. Okay, one is related to something that is found in Appalachia, not in a large quantity, but enough to get people wanting natives out. Any idea what's found in southern Appalachia? Gold. Very good. There's a gold vein that's found in southern Appalachia. Also, what new lucrative crop can be grown in the South, the deep South, that Americans want to start growing and exporting internationally? Well, we got tobacco for sure. Cotton. Very good. So the Cherokee, rather than taking up arms and going on the warpath, they decide to take this to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court case, Worcester v. Georgia, the Marshall Court will recognize the Cherokee and other tribes by basically saying, hey, these tribes, if they have treaties and they're sovereign nations, we have to look at the land that is theirs through a treaty as we would as the same as we would look at the sovereignty of a state. So the Marshall Court rules in favor of the Cherokee, but Jackson will do something that was unprecedented for this time. He says, Mr. Marshall's made his ruling, now I'd like to see him try to enforce it. Because Marshall doesn't have the army. He does. Now, what's interesting is that most of the events of the Trail of Tears, the removal of the Cherokee and other tribes, because there are a lot of tribes that get pushed out as a result of the Trail of Tears, and then do a removal act. The Trail of Tears is tied to the Cherokee, and thousands die, but the majority of the, Exodus happens not during Jackson's time in office, but in the 8th President of the United States, Martin Van Buren's time in office. So that's a conversation for a different day, which will be later in the lesson. The nullification crisis, to be brutally honest, is very, very boring, but it's important, okay? So here's the situation with the nullification crisis. From the time of Washington to the time of Jackson, America did not raise a tariff percentage much higher than about 5% to 15%. Most tariffs were somewhere between 8 to about 13 or 14% on imported goods. All right? But America is now moving in what style of an economic era? Okay, we have agriculture, but we also now have what? Industry. Very good, guys. We now have industry. We are in the midst of the first industrial revolution. So during the Jackson presidency, the tariff rose up to almost 25%. That was kind of unheard of at this period of time. So the industrialists in the North, why would industrialists love a tariff? Very good. It protects them and it gives them the opportunity to produce more and sell more because they are, they're able to sell their goods at a cheaper price. Why would Southern farmers hate the tariff?
Because they're being
Oops, sorry. You're on the right path.
because they have to buy stuff to make their.
Very good. They're buying imported goods. They're paying taxes on imported goods, but also where are they selling their agricultural goods to?
The state.
And
The
foreign nations, right? So they're worried that if these tariffs rise up, foreign nations might either raise retaliatory tariffs or place a what on their goods? What's the term when they won't buy your goods? Starts with an E. Embargo. Very good. So the South is fired up. South Carolina is going to call this the tariff of abomination. And what they're going to say is, you know what? We don't believe in the tariff. We're not going to pay it. We're not going to adhere to it. Sorry, they don't have to pay it, but they're like, we're not going to adhere to this tariff. And if you all don't lower the tariff, we'll secede or break away from the country. Had any other president been in office at the time, this would have been probably a little bit more of this could have probably dragged out and been a bigger problem. But Andrew Jackson usually does what he says he's going to do. All right. So what Jackson basically says is, okay, you nullify this tariff and you secede, I will march an army to South Carolina and I will hang John C. Calhoun from the first tree I can find. And they know he'll do it. So enter Jackson's two political enemies, John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. Henry Clay ultimately negotiates this deal where the tariff's going to lower back down toward around that 15%. But Jackson, being Jackson, wants something in the compromise. What Jackson's going to get out of the compromise is what is called the force bill. This is going to be a clause added into what article of the Constitution? What article gives the president their power? Article 2. Very good. It's Article 2. So, interestingly enough, Andrew Jackson never uses the force bill, aka the bloody bill. But who does? Not too long from now. What president uses it? You guys know this. A little bit later than that. That's actually a really good guess. That's a great guess, actually. Later than Polk. I like that. I like the guess of Polk. I'll give you an additional hint. This president uses it, never says he uses it, when the South goes into rebellion. For him. Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln will be the one that will use the force bill, even though he never does Lincoln utter the term force bill from Article 2 of the Constitution. Jackson used 12 presidential vetoes. This is more than the previous 6 presidents used combined. Now, there will be other presidents that will far eclipse the number of 12. People like Grant, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, even before Grant, Andrew Johnson. Others will have more vetoes. However, the big thing that Jackson will veto is the recharter of the National Bank. Okay, so remember, that was Hamilton's baby, right? Hamilton got the bank going. The bank missed its recharter. Then it was rechartered after the War of 1812. Now it's up for recharter again. And Jackson sees the bank as a horribly corrupt institution that only benefits the elite. And his supporters are like, yeah, down with the bank. More states' rights. Boo, National Bank. And this is like the whole platform of the election of 1832. And this is what will carry him to victory over Henry Clay. And ultimately, he kills the bank. And the money gets distributed out. And now you have all of these state banks, right? And private banks. Has anyone ever watched the classic 80s film Gremlins? We have a Gremlin situation that happens here because we had one bank that was a bit corrupt, Now we have a lot of banks that are corrupt. And ultimately, what we will see with these private banks, they were called wildcat banks, they recklessly lend and they start to collapse in 1836, heading into 1837. And it's going to lead to one of the most devastating economic panics and depressions in American history. This is the first time we saw unemployment rise above 10%. Now, will we see an economic crisis where it'll get higher? No doubt, yeah. Like the Great Depression, like about how high did it get then? Any ideas? Like 25%, okay? Yeah, Lyle's right, it's crazy. So, but this was, we'll talk more about the panic when we, next, farther into the lesson. So, on the top left, the Trail of Tears. These are tribes that were impacted by the Indian Removal Act. The Seminole, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, all relocated into present-day Oklahoma and parts of Kansas. There are other tribes that are also going to later be impacted. The Sauk, the Fox, the Kickapoo, the Black Hawk, what was left of the Miami, what was left of the Ottawa, what was left of the Shawnee. There's a lot of tribes that have an impact here. And then this is a little handy-dandy graphic on how a tariff works, which I think you guys get the picture. So if you have a roll of cloth produced in America for $4 and a roll of cloth produced in Britain for $4, and you put a 25% tariff on that roll of cloth, that means that British roll of cloth is $1 extra. You see why American industry would be happy about high tariffs? Because they're able to eliminate competition. And then there's Jackson's likeness that's on the $20 bill, which is still controversial. New party movements. So due to the era of common manhood suffrage, now you have more people involved in the political process. After we get through the first 4 to 5 presidencies, now we're going to start to see these new laws, these landowning laws, start to fade away, right? And here are some of the changing characteristics in the age of the common man. So this is basically like the 1820s, 30s, 40s is what I'm referring to. Emphasis on equality in the political process for adult white males, meaning that no longer do you have to own land to vote. Again, not a perfect scenario. This still leaves a lot of people out of the equation. Increased voter participation because landowning laws were now gone for voter eligibility. If you look at any election from 1824 to 1860, the popular vote just keeps going up and up and up and up and up. Voter participation continues to rise. The rise of interest group politics and also sectional issues, notably over the issue of slavery and tariffs. And what I mean by like splinter groups, has anyone ever heard of the Freemasons before? They're a fraternal organization. The early New Nation, a lot of like the founders were members of the Freemasons, and a lot of like commoners were kind of like kept out of that fraternal organization. It was sort of a status symbol at that period of time. So there's a splinter group that actually becomes a political party for like a hot second called the Anti-Freemason Party. They actually even run a presidential candidate in an election in the early 1840s. A changing style of campaigning. You're now campaigning to the common man. So I come over to this campaign, stop, and I'm like, hey guys, thanks for hearing me out. I hope you'll vote for me. Here's a box of Bibles. Enjoy. And then I come over to you guys and I'm like, hey, I brought a barrel of whiskey. who's ready to party, listen to what I have to say, and vote for me. This is a legit thing that went down. People had to like kind of figure out who they were addressing and dealing with, and they have to meet their interests to try to get their votes, right? What we call these were stump speeches, because not every campaign stop gave you the ability to get up on a stage. So sometimes you just had to roll out a stump, flip it over, climb on top of it, and tell everybody why you were so great and why they needed to vote for you. Have you heard that term before? Stump speeches? Well, yeah. All right. So after the War of 1812, following the Hartford Convention, the Federalist Party falls apart. There are some other Federalists hanging around, right? John Marshall's one of the main ones, and there's a handful of others, but overwhelmingly, most of the Federalists are done. So now this is the rise of the third party era. The Whig Party comes about, and the Know Nothing Party comes about. These are parties to oppose the Democratic Party. There's actually a little hot flash in the pan American Republican Party that was, or sorry, my apologies, the National Republican Party that was formed, not the Republican Party that you know today, but they were just like, they came and went in like about a 4 to 6 year period. So a little bit about the Whigs. The Whigs have some staying power. They are going to make it for a pretty decent run all the way up to just before the American Civil War, before they fall apart. Their platform was like basically like a Federalist Party reboot. It's like Federalist Party 2.0. They believed in industrialization. They wanted to bring back the national bank. They were all about infrastructure, building roads, bridges, canals, later railroads, telegraphs, etc. Okay. The Know Nothing Party was really one of the most bizarre and interesting political parties in American history. They're anti-Catholic, they're anti-Irish, and they're anti-German. And they mostly existed in commercial urban centers, places like New York and Baltimore, and most of their tactics were mob violence. There's actually a pretty famous film related to them. It's called Gangs of New York. Has anyone ever heard of it? It's a Scorsese film. They took to the streets and killed people in a number of different situations because they were into mob gang violence. It happened in New York, it happened in Baltimore, and it happened in other commercial centers. There's also going to be anti-slavery party movements. The first one was the Liberty Party, which was kind of came and went. The one that had the most like lasting sort of impact is going to be the Free Soil Party. But what I want y'all to think about is when we get to the early 1850s, think of the Republican Party as a beach umbrella, okay? We're going to pop that guy up, and a bunch of these splinter groups are just going to kind of get underneath it. And we'll talk more about that when we head into lesson 9. So that's all I got for the new parties. We got George Caleb Bingham canvassing for the vote. I love this painting. There's a lot of cool stuff going on, right? Look, you got new fashion. They're wearing pants. They're wearing coats with tails. And check out this guy. He's rocking a top hat, right? He's got his stump over here. He's got his satchel full of pamphlets. You got some guys he's trying to convince to vote for him. We don't know what these guys do. Maybe that guy's a landowner. That guy's a lawyer. This guy's wearing an apron, so he's probably what? Go ahead. You're good. What is he probably? He might be a baker. He might also be a Blacksmith. We don't know. Maybe he runs a livery. See, bud. What is does anybody know what a livery is? You know what a livery is? This is really fun for you to know what a livery is walking out of here today. Yeah, it's basically a place to keep your horses for a short period of time. It's like kind of like a parking garage for horses. So there you go, a livery. So we don't know. A student years ago pointed out when we broke this down, they were like, do you think Bingham purposely put the horse's ass behind the politician? I thought that was kind of funny. It's a good, why not? There was one thing that I did forget to mention. If you were ever wondering why the Democrats adopted the donkey as their mascot, it's a symbol of sort of strength, but it's also comes about because Andrew Jackson, his critics called him Andrew Jackass, and on political cartoons they put his face with donkey ears on a mule, and he thought it was hilarious. So they ended up adopting that mascot. All right. This is where we wrap up today, Westward Expansion. So now people are flooding to the west. Why do people want to expand west? They want more land. They want money. They want resources. Prior to the Civil War, there's dramatic territorial expansion, large waves of immigration. What are some European countries that immigrants are coming from? Germany and Ireland. Very good. Well done. Also Scandinavia, but Germany and Ireland, major waves of immigrants coming in. Then we also start to see economic growth, large-scale industrial growth, which we'll deal with later in the lesson. The Louisiana Purchase sparked our expansion. Americans' hunger for land and wealth is going to get them behind some rhetoric that we're all familiar with, and that is the ideology of manifest destiny. The guy that coins the term is columnist and politician John L. Sullivan. The whole premise of this ideology is America had the God-given right to move west and to stretch from Atlantic to Pacific. So American settlers start pouring westward into the Midwest, Southwest, and Texas. Conflict between Native Americans continue. Really, the conflict between Native Americans is going to carry us all the way through to the end of the 1800s. And it will ultimately conclude in a final decisive massacre. Are you all familiar with Wounded Knee? We'll learn about that later in the post-Civil War era. Yeah, it is. We're going to be dealing with the gold rush here after we learn about the Mexican War. But before we get into any of that, we got to talk about Texas, okay? So, Mexico gains its independence in the late 18 teens from Spain, right? And they're a republic for a while, and they are like, hey, Texas is not all that heavily populated, and this would be a really great place to grow what? Cotton. Very good. So they want to get more settlers down to Texas. Two Virginians, a father and a son, negotiate a deal with Mexico. The father and son, Moses and Stephen F. Austin, Texas. So here's the agreement. They bring a bunch of people down to Texas. They settle the land. They cultivate it, like 400 families, head on down to Texas. They have some rules. Number one, they have to pay taxes. Number two, no practicing slavery. Number three, they have to convert to Catholicism. And number four, they have to go through this process to become Mexican citizens. They don't do any of those things. So when the Mexican Republic is overthrown by a dictator by the name of Santa Anna, Santa Ana pretty much takes the agreement, tears it apart, and says, get out of here. And the Texans are like, nope, we're going nowhere. So if we look back here, that is the first flag of Texas. Come and take it. It is referred in reference to Battle of Gonzales. The Mexicans were going to take the cannon from, is that it?
Yeah.
Cool. Take the cannon from the Texans. If you were to go down to Texas, you would think that this revolution lasted a substantial amount of time. It lasted 6 months. It was a pretty quick one. But there are a couple of very devastating battles for the Texans. The Battle of Gilead, as well as the most famous one, the Battle of the Alamo. Very good. You guys knew that. Remember the Alamo. The Alamo is not the best place to have a battle because it was built by the Spanish as a what? No. It would have been great if it was a fort. It was built as a mission. It was basically a church. So nearly everyone was killed there. People like Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie. But the Texans are going to circle the wagons under the leadership of Virginia native of Rockbridge County, Sam Houston, Texas. And they will attack the Mexicans by surprise during a siesta at the Battle of San Jacinto, winning their independence, their country for about 9 years. But in 1845, they come in as a slave state. That will open up the door for what will ultimately take us into the Mexican War. Okay? So, this is a pretty awesome painting, American Progress by John Gast. A lot of symbolism going on in here. We have America's industrial growth in the east, railroads, steamboats, telegraphs, bridges, Lady Liberty, pushing west, plows, stagecoaches, Conestoga wagons, miners in reference to the California Gold Rush, and then look who's being pressed farther west, Native Americans and wildlife. So, we'll talk more about that as we move forward. The last thing to share here, these are the numerous wagon trails that were carved out into the West. Two that I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on the Mormon Trail, and I'm going to focus on the Oregon Trail. I'll also, bless you, I'll later, after the Civil War, talk a bit about the Bozeman Trail. And then check it out. There's the Alamo. Anyone ever been to San Antonio before? Very cool spot. Amazing food. It's kind of crazy if you go to the city, which you should visit. It's worth your time. The Alamo is like, boom, right in the city, in the middle. It just built everything around it. Check it out. All right. You guys good? Awesome.